Have you ever looked at the headlines and just felt like you were only seeing, the tip of a massive iceberg? What if there's a much larger, intricate strategic game unfolding, a multi-front challenge playing out right before our eyes, influencing everything from the global stage right down to your own wallet?
Yeah, that sense that there's more going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. Today, we're doing a deep dive into an extraordinary collection of documents, sources that paint this narrative of a really sweeping strategic effort, an effort to reshape the very landscape of power, both economically and geopolitically.
Right.
We'll be exploring material that describes a significant push by the Trump administration, a push to counter what it saw as, systemic challenges. Things ranging from persistent economic pressures to, deeply ingrained governmental structures.
It's definitely a compelling story, this picture of an administration trying to assert control and sort of redefine the operational boundaries.
It really is.
And our sources for this deep dive, they're incredibly diverse. We're talking detailed economic reports from places like the Fed and Investopedia. Then you have in-depth analyses of Supreme Court decisions, specifics from major international trade agreements, and even internal government documents, looking at agency staffing, budgets, things like that.
And a real mix.
A real mix. And our mission really is to meticulously extract the crucial insights from all these varied perspectives. We want to help you understand the complex interplay of policies and maybe the underlying motivations as they're described in the material.
Okay.
We'll be connecting what might seem like, totally separate pieces of information, weaving them together to reveal a cohesive, overarching narrative.
Yeah.
It's almost as if we're, witnessing a grand strategic plan unfold right from the documents.
Okay, so when we piece all of this together then, what does it truly mean for, the financial stability in your pocket and for that delicate balance of power on the global stage?
Big question.
Big questions. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's uncover the layers. We should probably start with inflation, right? It's this force that often feels invisible, but boy, it impacts everyone's daily life.
Absolutely. It's fundamental.
Our sources describe inflation fundamentally as a rise in the overall price level for goods and services. Pretty standard definition.
Right. Usually measured by things like the CPI, the Consumer Price Index.
Which tracks that basket of consumer goods.
Exactly. Or the PCPI, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. That's the one the Fed tends to prefer. Right,
the Fed's favorite. But what's truly fascinating here, and our sources really bring this out, is that inflation isn't just about rising prices. It's remarkably complex.
Oh, definitely.
Has both distinctly negative and, surprisingly, some potentially positive effects on the broader economy. It's not just this simple monolithic enemy.
Precisely. The negative impacts are, they're widely recognized, aren't they? We all feel them.
Yeah.
When prices rise, the opportunity cost of holding money increases. Your cash just doesn't go as far.
Your purchasing power erodes.
Exactly. And that erosion can significantly impact your savings, your retirement income, making your hard-earned money buy less tomorrow than it does today.
Which creates uncertainty.
Huge uncertainty. And that discourages both long-term investment by businesses and personal savings by individuals. People get hesitant, to commit funds when future values are so unpredictable.
And in extreme cases.
Well, in extreme cases, rapid inflation can even lead to hoarding of goods. People try to convert that depreciating currency into tangible assets as fast as possible. We've seen absolutely devastating historical examples of hyperinflation, where prices can skyrocket daily, just utterly collapsing economies.
Scary stuff.
It is. However, it's really crucial to remember, and our sources also highlight this, that moderate inflation can actually have some surprising positive effects. It can act almost like a subtle economic tool.
How so?
Well, for instance, it can help reduce unemployment by allowing real wages, that's wages adjusted for inflation, to subtly fall without requiring painful nominal wage cuts, which are, politically and socially very difficult.
Ah, I see, like a hidden adjustment.
Sort of. And a bit of inflation also gives central banks more freedom in monetary policy. It gives them room to cut interest rates during economic downturns. If you have zero or negative inflation, that flexibility is really limited.
Okay.
And interestingly, our sources point out that even massive monetary interventions we saw in the past, things like quantitative easing.
Where the central banks pump money into the economy.
Yeah, exactly. Injecting large amounts of money by buying assets. Even those didn't lead to the hyperinflationary spirals some economists predicted back then. It kind of challenged conventional wisdom, demonstrating how nuanced inflation management really is.
So it raises a question then.
It does. Is inflation always just a problem to be fought tooth and nail? Or maybe, under certain controlled conditions, can it actually be an indirect tool within a broader economic strategy?
Interesting perspective. And as we talk about control, our sources consistently point to the Federal Reserve's intense focus on what they call core inflation.
Right. Core inflation.
This metric cleverly excludes those volatile food and energy prices.
Exactly. It lets the Fed track the longer-term price trends more accurately, free from those noisy short-term market swings in gas or groceries.
And the Fed aims for a specific target inflation rate, usually around 2%.
Typically, yes.
Yeah.
Around 2%. And they meticulously adjust interest rates. That's their main tool to steer the economy toward that goal. They're always trying to find that elusive sweet spot of price stability and maximum employment.
It's a balancing act.
A constant balancing act. And placing this in the broader strategic context, the Fed's Monetary Policy Report for June 2025 gives us some fascinating insights into this ongoing battle.
What does it show?
It presents what the Federal Open Market Committee participants, the FOMC, that's the Fed's main policy-making body project for PCE inflation.
Their forecasts.
Exactly. But what's particularly revealing is they don't just give you a single number. They offer a median projection range, along with a 70% confidence interval.
So acknowledging uncertainty.
Absolutely. This isn't just technical jargon. It's a clear, visual acknowledgement of the inherent uncertainty and unpredictability in economic forecasting. If you look at their charts, the blue line might be their best guess, the point estimate. But those shaded areas around it, often showing 68% or 90% confidence intervals, illustrate the probable range of outcomes. A tighter band means higher confidence. A wider band signals greater economic unpredictability.
So they're upfront about not knowing exactly.
Precisely. This transparency really underscores the central bank's constant tightrope walk, managing price stability against this backdrop of complex, shifting economic forces. It reflects how deeply they acknowledge the unknown, and that directly impacts their policy decisions and, by extension, your financial landscape.
Okay, so if inflation is one side of the coin, what about boosting buying power? Our sources point to a dual strategy here, involving tax cuts and energy cuts.
Right. A two-pronged approach to try and put more money in people's hands, essentially counteracting some of that inflationary pressure.
And a core component of this, as revealed in proposed legislation, involves direct tax relief. Specifically, there's this highly discussed proposal to completely eliminate federal income taxes on tips for service and hospitality workers.
Yeah, that got a lot of attention.
It would directly affect millions of Americans, right? Putting tangible money back into their pocket.
It would. And this is where the strategic precision becomes really evident. The Fair Labor and Standards Act, the law governing wages and hours, it defines a tipped worker as someone who customarily and regularly gets $30 or more in tips monthly.
Seems specific.
It is, but that seemingly narrow definition actually covers a pretty significant portion of the U.S. workforce. We're talking about 2.5%, or around 4 million workers back in 2023.
So not a small group at all.
Not at all. So this isn't just some niche policy. It's a targeted, potentially substantial injection of capital into the disposable income of a specific large segment of the population.
Interesting. And you mentioned a mega tax bill from Congress.
Right. It's worth noting that while this tip tax cut is in the mix, the proposed mega tax bill from the Republican-led Congress doesn't include eliminating taxes on Social Security benefits. Some might have expected that in a broader tax reform discussion.
Okay.
So the tip tax cut really highlights a highly focused approach, boosting immediate buying power for a specific group. It's a precise measure, not necessarily a sweeping, broad brush change across the board.
And that targeted approach brings us to another debate, doesn't it? The Social Security tax cap.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
The cap. That's a fascinating counterpoint, always simmering in economic policy discussions.
Explain that quickly.
Sure. Currently, there's a limit, a cap, on the amount of income subject to Social Security taxes.
Yeah.
In 2023, it was around $160,200.
So income above that isn't taxed for Social Security.
Correct. And those who argue for removing this cap often point out that it's regressive. Higher earners end up paying a smaller percentage of their total income into the system than lower earners.
Makes sense.
They also emphasize the long-term funding challenges facing Social Security, arguing removing the cap could significantly boost its solvency.
But there's a counter-argument.
Always. A strong one, equally rooted in our sources. Social Security is designed as a payroll tax, directly tied to wages earned, and the benefits paid out are also capped.
Right.
So opponents argue it wouldn't be fair to lift the tax cap without also proportionally increasing the benefit cap. They say it would break the fundamental link between contributions and benefits that underpins the program.
Keep the balance.
Keep the balance. Plus, you hear the economic argument, often from more conservative viewpoints, that taxing income heavily above a certain threshold discourages extra effort, discourages innovation, because the marginal reward gets smaller.
So it's a real tension.
Absolutely. A fundamental tension within economic policy. Balancing tax fairness, providing economic incentives, and ensuring the long-term health of crucial social programs like Social Security. It's a complex balancing act, and the outcome has real implications for every single taxpayer.
Okay, so that's the tax side. What about the other prong, driving down energy costs?
Right. Another crucial front in this economic battle, and one that's incredibly tangible for people. It hits your daily budget directly.
Lowering gasoline costs especially, that's something everyone notices.
Definitely. It impacts everything from the daily commute to the cost of goods shipped across the country. Our sources indicate some optimistic forecasts for decreasing retail gasoline prices in the coming year.
Driven by what?
Largely driven by lower crude oil prices expected on the global market.
Okay, but global oil prices. That's incredibly complex, right? Not just simple supply and demand.
Oh, absolutely. It's far from a simple equation. What's truly illuminating here is the intricate interplay of global supply, demand, and crucially, geopolitics.
So what are the projections?
Well, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the EIA, their June 2025 short-term energy outlook projects that global liquid fuels production will continue to outpace consumption.
Meaning more supply than demand.
Exactly. Leading to a significant buildup in global inventories, basically more oil sitting around. This forecasted oversupply, if it holds, directly contributes to a projected Brent crude oil price average of around $65 per barrel in 2025.
And how does that compare?
To put that in perspective, that's nearly a $15 per barrel decrease from the 2024 average.
$15, wow.
Yeah, and that could translate directly to about a 35-cent per gallon reduction in gasoline prices at the pump right here in the U.S.
Okay, 35 cents is noticeable.
Very noticeable. But this isn't just some simple market shift. It feels quite strategic, heavily influenced by major geopolitical players.
Like OPEC Plus.
Exactly. Our sources highlight that OPEC Plus, that's the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, plus allies like Russia, announced a 411,000 barrel per day oil production increase for June. They're actively accelerating the rollback of previous production cuts.
So deliberately increasing supply.
It appears so. This aggressive move by OPEC Plus could bring as much as 2.2 million barrels per day back to the market by November. That signals a deliberate effort to reduce supply.
And internal dynamics, too.
Yes, Saudi Arabia, a key leader within OPEC Plus Pumikathono, is even noted to be potentially seeking to, well, rebuke some fellow members for exceeding their production quotas. That underlines the internal power plays within the cartel itself.
And beyond OPEC, geopolitics must play a role.
Hugely. There's a significant geopolitical nuance here that transcends simple supply-demand economics. Our sources reveal Saudi Arabia's very distinct non-alignment policy regarding the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They're meticulously maintaining relationships with both sides.
Interesting tightrope.
It is. And then you have China, which recently brokered a very significant diplomatic deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, both of whom are absolutely crucial oil producers for China.
Okay, so lots of moving parts.
Lots of moving parts. These complex, shifting alliances and deliberate production adjustments just underscore how seemingly simple energy prices are, in fact, a direct result of intricate global strategic maneuvers, designed perhaps to reshape alliances and influence international economic leverage. It's a real testament to how global power dynamics directly affect your wallet.
Okay, so we've talked direct economic levers, but the strategy seems broader. Our sources also reveal significant, almost surgical changes within government agencies themselves.
Right. Moving beyond direct relief into the destruction of government.
And these changes could be interpreted, couldn't they, as part of a larger, deliberate plan, maybe to realign bureaucratic power or, for some viewpoints, to counter what they might call entrenched resistance.
That interpretation is definitely present in some of the material, yes.
A prime example seems to be the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. Its workforce has seen a dramatic reduction.
Dramatic is the right word, a 26% reduction over the past year. And interestingly, many employees reportedly took voluntary resignation offers rather than face potential layoffs.
And this isn't just about personnel number.
No, it's accompanied by substantial proposed budget cuts as well, which further impact the agency's overall capacity to operate.
So this raises a really big question, doesn't it? What actually happens when a critical agency like the IRS, responsible for collecting the nation's taxes and enforcing tax law, faces such significant personnel and funding reductions?
It's a profound question, and the Taxpayer Advocate Service reports these are independent assessments of taxpayer rights and IRS operations. They vividly highlight the direct consequences.
Like what?
Well, they describe over 1 million hours spent idle simply due to antiquated technology. That leads directly to prolonged refund delays for taxpayers, impacting their financial planning.
Frustrating for people waiting for refund.
Immensely. Then there's a massive backlog of identity theft cases. We're talking around 387,000 unresolved IDTVA cases at the end of fiscal year 2025. That leaves victims just stuck in limbo.
Wow.
Plus severe challenges with communication regarding disallowed claims. Think about the Employee Retention Credit average wait times for claims processed in 2025 were over 18 months.
18 months.
18 months. It paints a really stark picture of an agency struggling to fulfill its core functions. And this situation, for some sources, might be interpreted as, well, a deliberate weakening of what they term a deep state component.
That idea of entrenched, non-elected officials resisting change.
Exactly. Weakening that component, thereby impacting its ability to collect revenue and provide adequate service.
And the proposed budget cuts are significant.
Very significant. The Republican administration's proposed budget, detailed in our sources, includes a formidable 20% reduction in IRS funding for the upcoming fiscal year.
20%.
And here's a key detail. When you account for the supplemental funding from the Biden-era Inflation Reduction Act that Republicans previously stripped away, that reduction in total available resources actually jumps to a staggering 37%.
37%? That's huge.
It's huge. And the Taxpayer Advocate Service itself explicitly noted that a reduction of that magnitude is, and I quote, likely to impact taxpayers and potentially the revenue collected.
So a dual challenge for the IRS.
Exactly. Internal operational and technological issues, now exacerbated by significant externally imposed policy shifts seemingly aimed at reducing its overall size and scope. It feels like a strategic move with broad implications for how taxes get collected and how taxpayers interact with the federal government.
But in parallel with these operational shifts and cuts, the IRS is simultaneously pushing for extensive modernization, right?
That's the other side of the coin, yes. There are initiatives like moving towards end-to-end paperless processing, significantly expanded online services, all designed on paper to reduce reliance on traditional in-person and phone support.
Streamline things.
The stated goal is clearly to streamline operations and enhance efficiency. However, as our sources meticulously note, these crucial technology upgrades absolutely must be thoughtfully matched with adequate personnel readiness and sound, comprehensive implementation plans.
It's not just about the tech itself.
Exactly. It's fundamentally about ensuring the people using the new systems are prepared and that the systems are integrated effectively, not just bolted on.
So placing this modernization effort in the broader strategic context.
Well, it presents a pivotal opportunity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
An opportunity to improve public trust and satisfaction with the tax system by making processes more efficient, transparent, and accessible. That's the potential upside. But the reports also highlight persistent operational issues that, despite these modernization efforts, continue to undermine that very goal. A really glaring example is the suspension of CAF numbers for tax representatives.
CF numbers? What are those?
A CAF number, or Centralized Authorization File Number, is absolutely crucial. It officially authorizes tax representatives like accountants or lawyers to communicate directly with the IRS on behalf of their clients.
So they can talk about audits, appeals?
Exactly. Audits, appeals, collection issues.
Yep.
When these CAF numbers get suspended, it effectively prevents thousands of taxpayers from retaining their chosen authorized representatives.
And that's a fundamental right under the Taxpayer Bill of Rights.
And these suspensions last a while. Our sources reveal they can last for months, unnecessarily burdening taxpayers during really critical phases like audits, appeals, and collections. The practice, particularly in cases where the tax professionals themselves might be victims of fraud rather than perpetrators, directly undermines the IRS's stated goals of fostering a professional, efficient, and trustworthy tax system. So there's a clash there. Modernization goals versus operational reality. A real clash. This ongoing struggle between the imperative for modernization and the reality of persistent operational challenges, especially compounded by those significant staff reductions we talked about, it really hints at a deeper, more profound effort underway.
Suggesting what?
It suggests perhaps a strategic intent to either radically streamline the agency's functions or maybe fundamentally alter its scope and power within the governmental structure. It's a complex, multi-layered dance between efficiency, effective oversight, budget constraints, and arguably political will.
Okay, shifting gears now to the global chessboard. Another critical arena in this multi-front challenge seems to be international trade. Specifically, that dramatic U.S.-China trade war that unfolded.
Ah, yes, the trade war, a major front indeed.
Our sources meticulously detail the tit-for-tat imposition of tariffs on billions and billions of dollars worth of goods.
Billions, covering almost every sector imaginable. Vital stuff like crude oil, agricultural products like soybeans, right through to complex manufactured goods like aircraft parts and automobiles.
It felt like a rapid escalating cycle of economic pressure.
It really was. And this is where the strategic use of economic leverage becomes crystal clear. Our sources document how, for instance, in June 2019, after the U.S. escalated tariffs on what was called List 3 goods to 25%.
China retaliated quickly.
Instantly. China swiftly retaliated by increasing its own tariffs on $60 billion worth of U.S. goods, with rates ranging from 5% up to 25%.
Well, it didn't stop there.
Not at all. On September 1st, 2019, China responded to new U.S. tariffs on List 4A goods by imposing additional 5% tariffs on $75 billion of U.S. exports.
Targeting major commodities.
Exactly. Crude oil again, crucial aircraft parts, vast quantities of soybeans, cars. This wave effectively expanded the scope of the trade conflict to cover nearly all U.S.-China trade. It was comprehensive.
But then the narrative shifted, right, with the Phase 1 deal?
It did take a significant turn with the signing of the Phase 1 trade deal in January 2020. That was a key moment.
What did China agree to?
As a key part of that agreement, China's finance ministry announced it would have tariffs on 1,717 specific U.S. goods, lowering rates on some items from 10% down to 5% and others from 5% down to 2.5%, effective February 14, 2020.
And purchase commitments.
Crucially, yes. China also committed to substantial purchases of U.S. agricultural products. The target was ambitious, $80 billion total between 2020 and 2022, aiming for an average of at least $40 billion per year.
That sounds like a big win for the U.S.
It was certainly presented that way, aimed at significantly reducing America's trade deficit. But here's what's truly fascinating, and maybe often overlooked.
What's that?
Our sources reveal that China only actually purchased about 73% of that agreed upon $40 billion annual target in agricultural products between 2020 and 2022.
Only 73%, so a significant shortfall.
A significant shortfall. And this demonstrates the complex, often incomplete, and strategically nuanced nature of these high-stakes economic negotiations. It reveals this gap between what's agreed on paper and what gets fully executed, likely reflecting ongoing underlying tensions and strategic calculations on both sides.
And beyond the direct tariff battles, the trade war had other consequences, didn't it? Broader ripple effects.
Oh, absolutely. Far-reaching and often quite subtle consequences across the global economy.
Such as?
Well, it reportedly led to the slowest Chinese manufacturing investment rate since way back in 1990. It also spurred unexpected growth in China-European Union economic ties as supply chains had to adapt and find workarounds.
Interesting. And politically?
Politically, importantly, it even contributed to a rise in Chinese nationalism. It allowed the Chinese leadership to strategically, blame the U.S. for domestic economic slowdowns. So it really created this ripple effect, shaping much more than just trade balances.
So placing this in the broader strategic context, U.S. trade policies under Trump weren't just about punishment.
No, not merely about tariffs as a punitive measure. They were deployed as a highly strategic tool, a tool intended to reshape global economic alliances and critical supply chains.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The South China Morning Post, one of our key sources, reported that the combination of the trade war and China's own domestic crackdown on shadow banking led to that slowest manufacturing investment growth rate since records began. And China's overall economic growth rate for 2019 dropped to 6.1%, the slowest since 1990.
And the EU connection.
Right. On the flip side, the trade war inadvertently resulted in significant growth of economic ties between China and the European Union. Primarily because commodity flows got redistributed, they had to go somewhere. And global supply chains had to strategically shift to find new paths around those tariffs.
And the USMCA agreement. The NAFTA replacement.
Yes, another source notes that the USMCA included very stringent rules of origin for automobiles. These rules requiring higher percentages of car components to be manufactured in North America.
The goal was to keep Chinese parts out.
That's how it was touted by the Trump administration, yes. as a direct mechanism to keep out Chinese inputs and strongly encourage domestic production and investment right here in the U.S. and across North America.
So part of a bigger picture.
Exactly. It exemplifies a broader, deliberate strategy to reposition the U.S. economy, to make it respond more effectively to emerging global powers, and, crucially, reduce dependency on specific regions like China.
Which raises that important question again.
It does. The question our sources prompt us to consider: how much of this was about immediate economic gain, about reducing those trade deficits, and how much was it about a deeper, long-term geopolitical influence, aiming to fundamentally restructure global supply chains and assert strategic dominance? It's a testament to the multifaceted nature of trade as a tool of statecraft.
Okay, let's move into Act 2. The legal arena and geopolitical maneuvers, perhaps one of the most critical battlegrounds in this, well, alleged multi-front strategic war, is the judicial system itself.
Right, where the very limits of executive power are constantly being tested and redefined.
And our sources highlight a really pivotal recent Supreme Court ruling, one that significantly limits the power of federal courts to issue those nationwide injunctions.
Yes, that was a major ruling.
And it's controversially described by some within the sources as a form of, quote, gamesmanship by the administration. Implicitly designed, they suggest, to project this image of inevitability of complete power, essentially making it far more difficult for lower court judges to broadly stop executive actions in their tracks.
Well, what's truly illuminating here are the immediate practical implications of that ruling. It changes the landscape significantly.
How so?
While it doesn't entirely prevent legal challenges, of course, it means that certain Trump executive orders, like a hypothetical one on birthright citizenship, for example, might not be universally blocked across the entire country for an extended period, say 30 days, which was becoming common practice.
So no more nationwide freeze right away?
Not automatically. Instead, district courts are now explicitly directed to act quickly, yes, but to provide relief only to the specific plaintiffs in that given case, not to apply the ruling nationwide or universally.
So if you sue and win, the ruling only helps you, not everyone else similarly affected?
Essentially, yes. That ruling only applies to the specific individuals or entities who brought that particular lawsuit, not automatically to every single person or group across the country who might be in the same boat.
That seems like a profound shift.
It is. It could affect thousands of cases across the country, far beyond the ones that make headlines, because it changes the fundamental mechanism by which executive actions can be broadly challenged and halted.
So the question becomes,
does this ruling truly cripple district courts, as some critics argue, by limiting their broad reach? Or does it simply redefine the scope of their authority in a way that, well, directly benefits a specific administrative agenda by preventing the widespread, immediate halting of policies?
It certainly seems like a shrewd legal move.
Designed, arguably, to streamline executive action by narrowing the judicial pathways for that kind of broad systemic opposition, making it harder for scattered legal challenges to derail a comprehensive agenda.
And our sources really lay bare the sheer scale of the legal challenges the Trump administration faced before that ruling.
Oh, the volume was incredible.
They reveal that in just 3 months, the administration was subjected to an astonishing 54 known district court injunctions.
54 in 3 months. That's intense.
And what's particularly noteworthy here, a detail from the sources, is that a significant number of these 42 of them, to be exact, were issued by judges appointed by previous Democratic presidents. Clinton, Obama, and Biden appointees.
42 out of 54. That pattern certainly stands out.
Suggests something beyond just random judicial review, perhaps.
Well, placing this in the broader strategic context, that sheer volume and pattern of injunctions, especially the nationwide ones, was definitely perceived by some within the administration, and this is referenced in our sources, as a direct impediment to the executive branch's power.
A roadblock.
A roadblock. It reflected, in the view of some within the federal judiciary itself, according to these sources, a belief that, quote, the wrong candidate was elected, and therefore the executive needed to be reined in.
So the administration saw it as political opposition via the courts.
That interpretation certainly exists in the material. And the administration's subsequent application to the Supreme Court to limit these very injunctions, as we saw directly in cases like the birthright citizenship challenge, can be seen as a direct, sophisticated countertactic.
Using the system against itself, in a way.
Exactly. A move to regain executive freedom, utilizing the legal system's own mechanisms against what was perceived as judicial overreach. It's a strategic maneuver designed to prevent what some sources call judge shopping by the party out of power.
Judge shopping.
Yeah, where litigants strategically seek out a sympathetic judge in a specific district, hoping to get a broad universal injunction that halts a policy nationwide, not just for them.
And the sources give examples of the kinds of policies being blocked by these injunctions.
They do. Compelling illustrative cases highlight the sheer breadth of policies targeted. These included court orders halting directives on foreign aid, initiatives related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, policies perceived by opponents as woke gender ideology, elements related to the Green New Deal, efforts to defund the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, and even cuts to National Institutes of Health, or NIH, funding.
A very wide range.
A very wide range. Each of these injunctions, while specific, collectively represented, from the administration perspective perhaps, a broad attempt by parts of the judiciary to block or at least slow down their agenda. This pattern and the administration's eventual response via the Supreme Court clearly illustrates a deliberate high-stakes strategy to reclaim executive authority in the face of what was perceived as systemic judicial resistance.
Okay, let's pivot now to the geopolitical front. A critical and often very dramatic piece of this multi-front challenge involves Iran's controversial nuclear program.
Right. Iran, always a complex and high-stakes issue.
Our sources meticulously detail how the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, the global nuclear watchdog, repeatedly reported Iran stepping up its uranium enrichment efforts, accelerating the program.
Yes, even as the UN Security Council was trying to find compromises and continuing to impose stringent sanctions, it underscored Iran's persistent push against that international pressure.
And what's truly fascinating and maybe strategically ambiguous here is the ongoing international debate around Iran's specific uranium enrichment levels.
The percentages, yes, that's key.
Can you clarify that for us? Natural uranium versus enriched.
Sure. Natural uranium is mostly composed of uranium-238 or 238U, which is an easily fissile. It doesn't easily sustain a nuclear chain reaction.
Okay.
But nuclear reactors, and crucially nuclear weapons, require enriched uranium. That means increasing the concentration of the fissile isotope, uranium-235 or 235U.
And most reactors use what level?
For most civilian nuclear power reactors, uranium needs to be enriched to typically around 3.5% to 4.5% U-235.
But Iran went much higher.
Our sources indicate Iran has significantly enriched uranium up to 60% purity.
60%. That sounds alarmingly high.
It does. And this specific level sparks intense debate internationally. While some argue emphatically that this level has no legitimate civilian use case for the quantities involved, one source explicitly states there is no civilian use case for 408.6 kilograms of 60% uranium.
Others disagree.
Others suggest more nuanced possibilities. They propose it could be for advanced research purposes, or for producing vital medical isotopes, or potentially for newer, more efficient modular reactors that might operate at higher enrichment levels.
Or something else.
Or even perhaps as a sophisticated insurance policy, a strategic leverage point in case diplomatic efforts to resolve the nuclear standoff ultimately break down completely.
So, sharply differing interpretations.
Absolutely. And these differing interpretations underscore the deep tension and pervasive suspicion surrounding Iran's true intentions. It raises that profoundly important question. Is 60% enrichment an undeniable, unambiguous step towards weaponization? Or is it a calculated strategic leverage point designed to increase their bargaining power in complex international negotiations without necessarily crossing the final threshold?
The ambiguity itself is strategic.
The ambiguity itself becomes a critical element of the geopolitical chess game.
Then came the really dramatic, globally impactful development. The United States strikes on 3 nuclear sites in Iran in June 2025.
Yes, that was a major escalation.
Targeting Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan, all central to Iran's nuclear infrastructure.
Key facilities.
And Trump himself announced it, didn't he? Calling it a very successful attack on Truth Social.
He did, stating definitively that a full payload of bomb BS was dropped on the primary site, Fordo, before emphatically declaring, now is the time for peace.
A very direct and overt act sent immediate shockwaves.
Absolutely. Placing this in the broader strategic context, these strikes, while publicly praised by the U.S. administration, were globally condemned by some nations and international organizations, raised fears of a wider regional conflict.
And prompted warnings.
Simultaneously, yes, they prompted an international nuclear watchdog to issue a stark warning about the implications for non-proliferation efforts worldwide.
But what was the actual damage? The U.S. claimed severe damage.
Right, that was the public claim. However, A more nuanced report cited in our sources indicates that these precise, calculated strikes only set back Iran's nuclear program by a matter of months, not years.
Months, not years. That seems limited.
It does seem limited, and that seemingly limited impact is critical, potentially, to understanding the strategic intent behind the strikes.
Meaning?
It illustrates an action possibly designed not for full-scale destruction, but maybe to send a very clear message. To assert dominance without triggering an all-out broader conflict that could destabilize the entire region.
A calculated risk.
Very calculated, it seems. The fact that the strikes were precisely targeted and reportedly resulted only in a setback of months rather than years strongly suggests a highly calculated approach. This wasn't presented as an act of total war, but perhaps a demonstration of capability and resolve.
Sending signals.
Intended to communicate a specific message to Iran about red lines, maybe to allies about U.S. resolve, and certainly to adversaries about the potential for military action. It highlights that delicate balance of power and the intricate strategic signaling at play in high-stakes international relations.
Using limited force as part of a bigger strategy.
Exactly. It speaks volumes about the use of limited military force as one component of a much larger multi-front strategy, designed perhaps to reshape regional power dynamics and expose underlying geopolitical tensions without committing to a full-scale military entanglement.
And adding yet another layer of intrigue, of complexity to this whole Iran narrative, our sources confirm a specific, highly controversial U.S. payment to Iran.
Ah, yes, the cash payment.
$1.7 billion, notably made entirely in cash. That method and the timing raised a lot of questions.
It certainly did. This specific detail, while seemingly straightforward on the surface, immediately raises that important question. What was the true strategic intent behind such a large payment, in cash? And how does it fit into the broader, multifaceted narrative of managing or confronting Iran?
The sources just state the fact.
Our sources primarily state the fact of the payment and its unusual method of delivery. However, the decision to deliver such a substantial amount in physical cash rather than through traditional traceable banking channels, and its timing in relation to the overall Iran policy and the unfolding events, including the nuclear program, progress, and those U.S. strikes, it adds a significant layer of intrigue.
Speculation abounds, I imagine.
Was it some kind of negotiation tactic to secure something specific? Was it related to a settlement of very old pre-revolution debts, as the Obama administration had argued about a previous payment? Or could it have been perceived, rightly or wrongly, as a form of ransom, perhaps related to prisoner releases, as some speculations in the sources themselves suggest?
We don't know for sure from these documents.
Not definitively from these documents. But the detail itself compels us to consider the covert alongside the overt methods used in high-level geopolitical maneuvers. It shows how seemingly isolated financial transactions can potentially be integral components of a complex tapestry of international relations and strategic influence. It underscores the depth of the strategic decisions being made and the various, sometimes unconventional tools employed on the global stage.
Okay, so here's where the pieces really begin to interlock, don't they? Revealing a more complete picture.
When you step back, yeah.
When we pull back and look these seemingly disparate actions, those bold tax and energy proposals aimed at boosting domestic buying power, the calculated restructuring and resource redirection of powerful government agencies like the IRS, the aggressive and nuanced trade tactics used against global economic rivals like China, the relentless legal battles over executive power fought in the judicial system, and then the dramatic, precisely targeted strikes on Iran's nuclear infrastructure.
They start to coalesce.
They really do. They coalesce into a truly compelling narrative. It's a narrative of an administration engaged in what our sources suggest is a deliberate multi-front challenge, an attempt to systematically dismantle what it perceives as entrenched powers, outdated policies, and maybe even resistant elements, both right here at home and abroad.
What's truly fascinating here is how the source material consistently illustrates this sophisticated pattern. The administration using the very mechanisms and instruments of the system itself.
Like legal challenges, tariffs?
Exactly. Be it legal challenges in the Supreme Court, the imposition of trade tariffs, or the strategic deployment of executive orders. Using those tools to push against established norms or what it perceived as deep-seated resistance.
Also from limiting judicial power.
Right. From strategically seeking to limit judicial power by redefining the scope of injunctions to aggressively rebalancing global trade relationships and then directly confronting foreign adversaries through calculated military action. The actions described in our sources, taken together, depict a determined, coordinated effort.
An effort to assert control.
To assert control and fundamentally redefine the operational boundaries of government and international relations.
Can you connect a few specific examples again?
Sure. Consider the internal IRS staffing cuts and proposed budget reductions combined with those efforts to modernize the agency. That isn't just about efficiency, right? It could be seen as a dual approach. Make it more streamlined, yes, but simultaneously reduce its overall size and arguably its regulatory reach. The Supreme Court ruling on nationwide injunctions is another prime example. Legal means strategically employed to alter the judiciary's ability to broadly block executive actions, thereby clearing the path for the administration's policies.
And trade.
In the trade realm, the tariffs and that subsequent Phase 1 deal, even with its partial fulfillment, clearly demonstrate a willingness to use economic pressure as a potent tool to achieve specific strategic aims, like reshoring manufacturing or reducing trade deficits.
And Iran.
And the Iran strikes. Militarily impactful, yes, but also carrying a powerful diplomatic and strategic message, designed perhaps to reshape regional dynamics and send a clear signal of resolve without full commitment.
So not just isolated incidents.
It paints a picture that suggests this isn't merely a series of isolated policy decisions. It looks more like a strategic chess match being played out in public view, intended to shift power, challenge existing paradigms, and achieve very specific, interconnected objectives. The overall picture emerging from these sources is one of deliberate and comprehensive strategic maneuvering.
So why does all this matter to you, the listener? This deep dive, it offers you a truly unique, maybe a more comprehensive perspective on the powerful forces shaping your daily life. Forces that are often unseen or, understood only in isolation.
By connecting the dots.
Exactly. From the tangible prices you pay at the gas pump and the amount of income you actually take home to the fundamental authority and efficiency of the government agencies you interact with, like the IRS, and even that broader global stability that intricately impacts your future security and prosperity.
It touches everything.
It really does. Understanding these intricate maneuvers, these strategic plays described in the sources, allows you to be truly well-informed. It empowers you to look beyond just the surface headlines, to appreciate the profound complexity of the forces at play, and maybe connect the dots in a way that provides deeper meaning to the news you consume every day.
And placing all of this in the broadest strategic context, this comprehensive narrative that emerges from the sources really illuminates several critical themes, doesn't it?
Like what?
Well, the inherent limits of power, for one. The surprising resilience of long-established systems, both governmental and international. And that constant dynamic tension between executive authority and other branches of government, as well as between national interests and international actors.
It shows how interconnected things are.
Absolutely. It highlights how seemingly domestic policy changes like those targeted tax cuts or the restructuring of a national agency can be intricately linked to broader geopolitical strategies and vice versa.
So whether you agree with the policies or not.
Exactly. Whether you personally agree or disagree with the specific policies described or the underlying motivations suggested in the material. Recognizing the strategic intent and the interconnectedness of these actions, as meticulously described in these diverse sources, provides critical insight into how power operates, how it evolves, and how it adapts in our complex modern world.
It shows things aren't always random.
It demonstrates that what might appear as isolated events are very often, or at least can be interpreted as, carefully choreographed components of a much larger deliberate design, constantly working to shift the balance of influence.
So after unpacking all of this intricate detail and seeing how these diverse elements might connect into, well, a grander strategic design, consider this for a moment.
Okay.
If these actions are indeed part of such a deliberate, overarching plan, as suggested by the narrative woven through our sources, what unforeseen domino effects might they trigger? Across the global landscape and maybe within the very fabric of governance itself in the years and decades to come.
The unintended consequences.
The unintended consequences, the long game. It's definitely a thought worth exploring long after our deep dive ends today.